Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
The Web Platform Podcast is a proud O'Reilly media partner. As such, one of the benefits we provide our listeners, that's you, are special discounts such as 50% off of ebooks and 40% off of printed materials. So this includes but is not limited to books on web technologies, as well as other technologies you may be using. So your discount code is all caps PCBW. That's PCBW, all in caps. So head over to O'Reilly.com, that's OREILLY.com, right now to get all your favorite tech books at much lower prices.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. This is episode number 75, Best Practices for JavaScript. Happy 2016, everybody. This is our first show back after the holiday break. I hope everybody got as much rest as I did. I think I had 11 straight days off, and I didn't do anything. It was spectacular. I played a lot of Fallout 4. Fortunate amount of Fallout 4, but that's besides the point. So I'm your host, Danny Blue, and today we have Axel. Say hello.
Hello. Okay.
And Nico.
Hey guys.
So, like I said, today we're going to talk about best practices for JavaScript in JavaScript, however you want to phrase it. So the way I want to kick things off first is just ask, what is a best practice? What does it mean? How does something get tagged a best practice? I think is maybe a better way to phrase it. And whoever wants to take over can go ahead.
I think it's somewhat of a loaded term because a lot of the time something is kind of like regarded as a best practice, and there's like a lot of cargo code involved in there. So it's also important to keep an eye out on what's a best practice versus what's just regarded as being a best practice, but maybe not. It isn't entirely so. But besides that, I guess it's things that most people agree on that should be good for developing a code base that's usable and maintainable.
Yeah, it's kind of a mixture very often because you have, opinion and taste always plays into the mix. And for some best practices, there are clear reasons why they make a lot of sense, why they're useful. For example, you can look if you look at IFEs, at immediately invoked function expressions. If you do that, there's the clear advantage of local variables only living inside of it. But then you have other best practices, especially when it comes to variable declarations and so on. And those are more a matter of taste. And then you have communities that have similar taste and they adopt similar practices.
So our best practices. Best practice seem to be. It's not like there's one person that. A lot of people try, but best practice seem to be kind of a culmination of the communities around them.
It's diverse for sure. And I find taste fascinating because very often I find something disgusting and that's just totally subjective. And then I change my mind and I use the thing that I previously found disgusting, and then I found my old way disgusting. So it's very when it comes to taste, it's fascinating how strong the emotions are that even like source code can evoke.
Yeah, you have to be flexible, that's for sure.
And you have to, and it's very easy to kind of, because it's so difficult to decide what's actually better or worse. Often things get easier if you join a project and then you just do whatever's the common practice of the project, because then consistency matters so much.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something similar to in that vein. That's best practices are very community-driven, in my opinion. Like if you look at React, they are all styled in a certain way. The different modules that there are and their APIs and philosophies and whatnot are all pretty consistent with each other, right? So it's important to have that consistency, not just maybe not just even in a project, but also in the ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. What some people, especially people that are, some people get very, very evangelical about whatever there is, whatever their particular flavor of doing something is for, so some people are really, really specific. If you have an anonymous function, that there has to be a space between the function keyword and the brackets, and some people do. I think that's a JavaScript the good parts thing.
And Crockford is very colorful metaphors when it comes to parentheses, for sure.
Yeah, he does. It's whether or not you agree. It's still a good JavaScript. The good parts is still a good thing to pick up. But with that said, you might feel very, very strongly about one thing, and then you are brought into a project that's in progress. Don't go changing it up on everybody. If the larger group has decided this is the way to do it, everybody needs to kind of move in the same direction, or the best practices don't really work. And then you end up with a lot of messy things. Now, this kind of leads into, again, another broad, completely loaded question, which is there a right way to write JavaScript? And so I know that's a terrible question, but...
No, I have a good answer. But
oh, do you? Oh, okay, all right. No. Go ahead.
I've been wondering about that as well, because I did a lot of functional programming as well in Haskell, and there seem to be almost like two groups of people, and some of the people very much like a very abstract style of functional programming. They introduce a lot of abstractions, and other people do not like it as much. And the way the way it would make sense to me is that if you program, you kind of want to put in code how your thinking works. And given how different people think, it's no surprise that their code and their preferences with regard to how they code, that those are so different. And for me, well, functional programming is obviously very clever. It's nice to have that set of tool in JavaScript, but some of the functional programming stuff gets too abstract for me, and even occasionally array prototype reduce takes me too long to build. It's obviously clever. You can write very, very concise, or rather compact code with it. But for myself, I always find it a bit, or I don't like if it takes me too long to figure out how something works. But other people are perfectly happy with it, and they absolutely love that kind of style and use abstractions and higher order functions as much as they can, and generic programming.
I think there's a lot of wrong ways to structure your code. But I wouldn't say there's a single right way of structuring every single JavaScript project, because even more so nowadays we have like embedded software and web apps, node apps, and so on. So it's becoming increasingly harder to lay out a foundation and say, hey, this works for absolutely everything. Let's do this forever and never change it again. Especially with the ever-evolving software cycle we find ourselves in nowadays, where front-end tooling changes like every 6 months or so, like best practices especially, or what's regarded as best practices. So I think it's something that you should pay attention to and try to structure your code in a way that's not wrong or inherently wrong or that could be hard to maintain. But other than that, I think there's a lot of different ways that we can structure our code. But more specifically, I think there's a few contentious topics, and here I may be going a little bit off topic, but if you start talking about like treating your data as something that's immutable state and using snapshots and whatnot versus using like kind of the Angular dirty chicken model or something like that, or older like Backbone, that doesn't really impose any rules regarding your data and your models. There are different ways in which you can structure your code that aren't inherently or wrong or good.
Yeah, and in many ways, writing source code is like writing a textbook. So I find that, or for a long time, I wondered why I never totally liked my code that I had written just a few hours ago. And with time, I found out that actually it takes me multiple passes. So if I write something, I just don't touch it for, say, 2 weeks. And then if I look at it again, I can make it better. And so this kind of using source code to explain ideas, I find that very important. And that's why taste matters so much, and why it's so hard to put into rules. And this kind of and what's important to me is that code is as simple and as self-explanatory as possible, and that's a style that you can even adopt in C. So you don't need fancy patterns or fancy language mechanisms for that. You just try to lay out your ideas as clearly as possible in source code.
Yeah. Lately I've come to think of code design in terms of APIs for the most part, and not just like a REST or HTTP API, but I mean like the touch points between two different components, for example. I think if you start thinking about your code in such a way that you think about the APIs or the touch points first, where other pieces of code will interact with your own or a particular component, it becomes much easier to write code that's easier to understand and even to implement, rather than if you try and do it the other way around, where you just implement wherever you need to have done, and then the API becomes what comes out of it, rather than what you would have wanted to get out of it. Not sure if I explained that correctly.
Sure. I think a really good example of something that you guys have touched on a couple times, just how things change in the idea of taste has come up quite a bit, and which I really like as a way to describe it. Angular came up, and if you look at the way that you would structure an Angular app 3 years ago versus the best practices for doing it versus the best practices for doing it now, it's completely different. It's, well, not completely different, but there are some basic principles that are very different. And so it is a good idea to keep an open mind, and just because you're learning how to do something one way today, tomorrow somebody might come up with a very good reason why that's not a good idea. And
I think that's you brought an interesting point up, that sometimes libraries or frameworks don't do a very good job of putting their best practices out there. So when Angular first came out, and for a long time after that, it was really unclear what the best practices were as to develop code using Angular. And I think React is kind of in that place right now, where even if I do think there is like a single good way to approach React code, it's pretty hard to figure out on your own how to learn to develop applications using React properly. And that's tricky to do because you either end up writing like a series of tutorials that may not be for everyone, or your documentation may become too verbose and confusing to most people. So it's also hard from the point of view of a maintainer to try to come up with something that's able to convey how people should use your thing while not making it sound like it's the most important piece of software ever. So here's a 200-page manual that you must memorize before you can even touch the library.
Yeah, and so it's definitely tricky. It seems like it's trickier to learn the best ways to do something versus the things you should definitely not do. And a lot of people, if you're trolling around on Stack Overflow or whatever, you'll see people, you're like, I'm doing this. This feels wrong. Is this an okay thing to do? And then one of the first comments or answers will immediately be like, this is a terrible anti-pattern. And sometimes they'll tell you it's why, and sometimes it's not. Can you guys explain what an anti-pattern is? Because we've talked about trying to find the best patterns or the best structures or the best ways of doing things, but those seem to be harder to nail down. What exactly is an anti-pattern, and why are they important to know, and how are they potentially easier to learn?
Yeah, I think in general, anti-patterns are actually easier to figure out, because with an anti-pattern there's always something bad about it. So it's kind of you do something, and then with an anti-pattern you can, should I wave so that it recognizes me as the speaker? Google Hangouts, I'm the speaker. No, okay. So the and if there's something clearly wrong with it, then it's easier to talk about it. Whereas the benefits of patterns that are not anti, those are sometimes harder to pin down or more controversial, let's say.
Can you give an example of a fairly well-known anti-pattern in JavaScript?
Global variables, maybe, because so much code lives on a page, the name clashes can become a problem. So you want to be careful with creating global variables, or to create as few global variables as possible, maybe.
And that right there was really easy to explain.
Yeah.
Right? So like that is an anti-pattern, and that was very easy to explain. This is generally a bad idea. This is why.
Yeah, and it's funny that he mentions that, because I still get in some of my open source projects issues about the browserified bundle being not included in a global variable if they use browserify or things like that completely throw me off, because it's like, how are you using browserify to compile the already compiled bundle, you know?
Yeah, it's tricky, and there's some a lot of style guides will include some things like that as well. And there are some really well-known ones, and then there are other things there are other anti-patterns that can be argued, but for the most part, anti-patterns are a bit more straightforward, because there's a lot of times there's something inherently dangerous about doing it that way. Like I said, I think global variables is a really good example where it's really easy to what are like the two hardest problems in computer science are naming variables and like cache invalidation or something like that. It gets the same thing. You're like, oh man, what did I name that other thing? And then you end up overriding the variable. Yeah. So it gets really, really tricky.
And naming it is even forming concepts is hard. So there's even science, the science of concepts, and they tell you that whenever you have to categorize something, then with some things it's easy. So you have, for example, if you have a German Shepherd, that's clearly a dog. And then you define a dog, and you say, well, a dog has fur and it has a tail. And then there's dogs that don't have a fur.
And
Or
bears have fur and tail. Is a
Yeah,
bear a dog?
yeah,
You run into
exactly.
that same kind of stuff. Typing is tough.
And then there's even things like
Shepherds who are Herman.
every chair is furniture, and then but you also have chairs in cars, and maybe they're not furniture in cars, or stuff like that with clocks as well. You have clocks in like huge clocks in the church towers, and you have watches, and you have alarm clocks. So categorization is really problematic, and once I read that, I was really relieved, because sometimes I'd name, like on one day I'd name a class foo, and then the next day I didn't feel confident anymore. I renamed it. So and that's why sometimes you just have things that are between two categories, and then it's almost, you'll change your mind about them frequently, and that's just how reality seems to work. So it's quite fascinating.
Something that follows from what you just said about refactoring is that a lot of what we do depends on the context. So I had that thing too happen to me, where you write some piece of code, and then a few days or even weeks later you come back to the piece of code and you read and it says foo, and you're like, why did I name this foo? I'll just rename it to bar. And then you keep reading the code for a while you are trying to figure out what's wrong. And then you realize that in that context, foo actually made sense. So you sometimes rush into refactoring something just because you haven't read that piece of code in a while. And that's also something that we should keep in mind, that we need to read even more than we do write code.
Yeah.
And I think that's another argument for why writing readable code is so important as well, because somebody else is going to have to eventually, somebody else other than you is going to have to look at whatever you've done, and hopefully be able to infer or figure out exactly what's happening. And again, like there's some other thing, write code like the guy that has to maintain it is a murderer and knows where you live.
A violent psychopath. Yeah, that's the variant I heard.
I think it makes more sense to make an analogy like write code as if you were one of those Game of Thrones soldiers who are like all trying to be the same thing, so that you don't. If you read someone else's code, you might as well think you wrote it yourself because it's indistinguishable. I think that makes more sense than being like paranoid about your coworkers.
I think paranoid about coworkers.
In many ways, it's nice to be dispensable. Well, not in every job position, but as a programmer, I always thought it was nice to be dispensable.
Yeah.
Because then you can move on to new projects, and kind of the thought of collective code ownership is nice, because if you want to do something new, you can. And if you're the only person who understands your own code, then that puts you in a tricky position. And you have the bust factor as well, the idea of a bust factor, like how many people in your company need to get killed or until the company goes bankrupt, something like that, because nobody understands the code anymore, stuff like that. So you want to increase the bust factor, and you want to be as dispensable as possible.
Yeah. If nothing else, being dispensable means that it's not necessarily you that's going to get that call on Saturday.
Absolutely.
Like at 6 in the morning because they told you not to push code to production on Friday, but you're like, it's fine, I didn't do anything wrong, and then you're the only guy, so you get the call.
Exactly.
So that's on. So we've talked pretty broadly just about best practices for things. We've talked specifically about a couple things with JavaScript. Now, JavaScript lives very popularly in two environments now. It lives client-side in your browser, and it lives server-side. So there are there are some things that are different about each environment. There are certain things that your browser gives you that you don't get in Node, and there are certain global values that you get in Node that you don't get in the browser, and vice versa. So, excluding like pretty obvious differences, are there different best practices for writing JavaScript on, and not even say just browser versus client? People do node bots as well. So are there different best practices for different devices or environments that you're building in, or are they pretty much all encompassing, or is it a combination of those two?
I think they are. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Are vastly different environments lead to vastly different practices. Like in the context of a web browser, you have to be aware of the performance implications of writing a ton of code, the performance implications of interpreting jQuery in mobile, or even when it comes to bundling, whether you should just bundle everything into a single script, or multiple different scripts, or a script per page plus the combined script. So there's a lot of different performance implications to take into account in the browser, and then there's the fact that you have global variables, a ton of different runtimes. It's not just like in Node, where you have 2 or 3 different runtimes where your code is going to be running on maybe your development environment and the production servers. And in embedded software, it's even simpler in that regard, where you just have the device your code is going to be running in on. So it's definitely something that I think demands best practices for each individual environment, besides things that can be shared, like code style and so on.
Yeah, and with the client, you have, like, things are a lot more interactive. But I find the difference fascinating when it comes to giving desktop apps that are based on web technology, when it comes to giving those more abilities. And for example, some of the ways of writing desktop apps in JavaScript right now, they use Node.js, so basically use a server-side approach. And in the client, you have to be more careful with how much access you allow apps to have. So security is an issue. And the alternative is always not to use something server-based, but to give client-side web apps more capabilities. So access to the local file system in web browsers, that has increased and has gotten better over the years.
Yeah.
Whereas a few years ago, the only choice you had was to bridge over to something like Node.js. So
right.
Those are, and I find that fascinating too, like server-side approach versus letting apps do more in a web browser.
Yeah, and it's also a thing where it's kind of like a waterfall, where you have like mscript and compiling like Doom 3 to Node, and then compile for the browser, or compiling like Linux for Node, and then it becomes like very different, where you have different capabilities, because like you said, in the browser you don't have as many options when it comes to cryptography or dealing with files, and usually you end up having to offload some of the tasks that you have to a server.
But it's interesting that desktop apps are becoming sandbox these days. So I think for OS X, a few years ago, a desktop app could do whatever it wanted, and now it's becoming more sandboxed. So desktop apps are becoming more like web apps in that way.
Yeah, yeah, and that's another interesting point because I don't think there was anything as easy as it is to distribute an application that works on any operating system as it is nowadays using Node and Electron.
What time is it in Argentina, by the way?
3 p.m.
Okay, PM. So the afternoon, right? Okay, yeah, okay. That's not too bad.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I really hope he says PM. 3 a.m. is awfully early.
Depends on your lifestyle, though.
I guess so. So anybody that's listening to the show, we harp on testing a lot. So, and this is all kinds. We talk about unit testing and things like that a lot. Do the same best practices carry over to testing? So there again, I feel like this might be kind of just like the same thing where you're writing the same language, but it's kind of in a different environment, even though it's technically not a different environment. But are there differences when you're writing a test versus when you are just writing a component, or you're writing your application, or or anything like that? Like is shared state bad in a test when it can be okay in an application? Things like that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true because if you look at like Jasmine or Mocha, like enough said. What was Axel's mention of a bad practice? Global variables, they're everywhere in testing libraries. They are supposed to encourage good practices, not bad practices. Because why do you write tests? To improve the overall code quality of your code base. And if you already have libraries that are popular and are well regarded, that have all of these bad practices built into them, it's already not a good start, right?
I think a key thing about testing is that UI testing is hard. So as long as I'm always very happy if I can test stuff of my apps, and if it's just a unit test, if it's not UI yet, and as soon as you get into UI testing, that's when things become really tricky.
Yeah, doing full, writing automated full end-to-end tests is, it's a discipline pretty much all into its own, right? There's a lot of stuff like there are a ton of tools out there for it, but it can get really complicated and really hairy. And they'll yell at you a lot if you change their automation ID that you assigned.
And I'm not entirely sure that the more tests, the better. So I think, because if you have more tests, that's also weight that you have to refactor and maintain. So it's always a balance.
Yeah, and I think something that relates to that is that, and a bit with what I said earlier, that we are pretty lax on coding style and coding guidelines when it comes to testing. So we generally, a lot of developers don't care at all about like copying and pasting. So you have like 20 test cases, and instead of going through a loop, and this is JavaScript, right? You can create function calls in a loop or something like that, and create functions on the fly and so on, and wrap little helpers and whatnot. But we end up copying a lot of test cases and just changing a couple data values. And this is also something that adds a lot of load and makes it harder to come up with tests that are maintainable. And if you change something slightly, your code, you break 20 tests and are crippled for a week.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think developers don't care as much about? Because you're absolutely right. You can have somebody that just poke at myself. So I tend to, I like everybody else try to write really clean code. As soon as I start writing unit tests, I want to write the tests, but I don't care quite as much about how it looks. I don't care quite as much that it's that it's maybe a little bit messy. I don't care that maybe I'm copying this exact thing from this place over to this place. So is it just a mental state? Is it something where you feel like, well, this isn't the app part, so it doesn't need to be as well thought out?
Well, I think giving it a little less effort makes a lot of sense, but I've changed my mindset towards that tests are also code that I'll have to maintain, and then that can prompt you to be able to clean or to write slightly cleaner test code maybe.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I actually really hadn't even thought about it until right now, but it is true. Like I said, me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, for some reason it just skips a little bit. Like something you just don't give it the care and thought that you do with other things. And this is not for everybody. I'm sure there are some people that are very, very particular about how they write this stuff.
It's mostly psychological, like even not entirely conscious. Like maybe it started off as something that was mostly a chore, something that you had to do because your employer demanded it, and then you learned, oh, okay, this is actually something that I need to do because it improves my code. And then we never really put that much weight into it as a community, even though it's well regarded. It's one of those things that when asked, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, testing, absolutely, it's super important. But then half of those people don't even do it. And it's something that it has a strong like persona, but it needs more actual practical implementations. And if you like look at books on testing, there's maybe one or two that are decent about JavaScript testing, but then how many books do you have about like Angular background? It's
right. No, I think that's interesting. I mean, so far it definitely just sounds like the whole idea is of the best practice in general. It's just about being in the right state of mind for something. Just because you write something that's technically up to best practices doesn't mean it's good code, but you are in that correct mindset to at least make it look nice. So one thing that I want to touch on a little bit, I don't want to get into an argument about it, and I don't want to suck up the rest of the time with it, but I wanted to brush a little bit to just touch a little bit on inheritance in JavaScript. So this is a very specific thing, and again, we're talking about where some people think certain things are gross, some people think certain things are great. So JavaScript is a prototypical language. Pretty much everything in JavaScript inherits from the object prototype. So that's all well and good. But especially with the new keyword is a big thing. I personally don't really care about the keyword itself, but it's the idea of kind of class-based inheritance and prototypical inheritance. And so when you guys are trying or coming up or helping to, or either seeing or trying to come up with best practices for inheritance in JavaScript, especially with classes now being in ES6, is there, and again, this at this point is just purely opinion, do you guys have, like, this is the way that you should handle inheritance in JavaScript? Is it classes? Is it object.create? What is it? Is it just mixins? Is it just using Lodash extend? Which is, I guess, technically is an inheritance, but so what is it?
I can start with things that are not controversial.
Excellent.
And what's awesome about JavaScript is that you can create objects directly, and that's very helpful because you create an object, you play with it, and that makes you much more flexible than in other languages, and the single pattern basically is not necessary. And that way you can write your code much more exploratory. You start with a single object, and then you introduce factories for objects later on. So that's absolutely great to have. And I think historically it's a bit unfortunate that we have constructor functions and not constructor objects, because if you look at a constructor C, the thing that's most important about a constructor is C.prototype, not C. So it's a bit weird that C is the name of the thing that produces the instances and not C.prototype. So constructor objects would be nice. And I think another thing we can agree on is that single inheritance usually is not enough, and personally I'm a big fan of mix-ins and of traits. And so for me personally, I think classes are okay. I'm not like their biggest fan, but what's nice about them is that before there were many different approaches for doing inheritance, and you already see some of the libraries and frameworks migrating to ES6 classes, and that makes code much more portable, which is really, really nice. So you had like various ways of creating factories for instances, and with ES6 there's now a standard, and that helps tooling as well, because tools have a cat. And with so IDEs know what to expect and what inheritance mechanism is a cute cat. So that's really one aspect about classes that I like. And the last thing is that classes without mix-ins are just not very useful. And to me, classes mainly have always been kind of this location where you assemble mix-ins. That has always been, like in the past, before I did more JavaScript programming, that's how I always saw mix-ins.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with what you said, so there's not going to be much controversy here.
Excellent.
One thing I would touch on is that I also like using like plain objects for everything, and I think classes or inheritance or prototypes are mostly useful for performance reasons. And when you don't really have performance issues, I really prefer using some sort of composability pattern or mix-ins or something like that, where you just add stuff into an object and that's it. Yeah, even calling functions with your object and doing things with it as a pure function. But I agree definitely with the fact that classes have unified the community around a single way of doing inheritance. Before classes, if you wanted to do inheritance in JavaScript, you would probably have to go to Stack Overflow and copy and paste something, or use Slowdash or some other utility library that tells you how inheritance should be done, or the util module in Node. Whereas now you at least have some sort of standardized way of inheritance. It's not great yet, because I think classes in ES6 still lack a lot of capabilities, like the ability to declare functions within the class scope that can be reused across the methods while not being available outside the class. So like private functions for the class and so on. But they're definitely better than prototypal inheritance the JavaScript way.
And me personally, it always helps me to think about things more on a conceptual level. So I try to, like, in my head, I kind of try to structure the problem space, and then what I end up using for for creating instances and so on, that's in more of an implementation detail. And the nice thing about JavaScript is that for a lot of problems, you don't even need any kind of OOP. You can program in a very functional style for a lot of stuff. So you use whatever is there, and that's what I always disliked about Java, that they forced in this kind of weird object-only mindset, and it's great that we don't have that in JavaScript.
Yeah, particularly because you end up spending a lot of time writing boilerplate code for objects that are just like a map or so on, or maybe a little bit more complicated than a map, but something that's very rudimentary and doesn't have a lot of methods and so on, and you still have to create a file for it and test someone else. I could start talking about dependency injection and whatnot, but completely.
Yeah. We mentioned before just about like the styles of people's styles of coding, right? Like some people prefer a lot of abstraction, some people don't. I tend to be of the mind where I will write a method that's called create car, whatever it is, and at the beginning maybe all that does is it just returns an object, which again, one of the good things about JavaScript is that you can just say here's an object. You don't have to go through anything to get one. But then maybe as different things become complicated, things become more complicated, and maybe I decide I need to have a class that does something. I will still have my create car function, except now instead of just returning an object, it will return new car or whatever instance of that class. And that's the way that I tend to do it, and I've seen other people do it in a similar way as well when you're talking about implementation details, so that if you have to change how something is implemented, you don't have to re-implement it, as it were. You change the implementation, but you don't re-implement. Maybe a way to think about it, but cool. But thank you guys.
But for my own code, I'm always happy to just refactor as long as it's automated. So so very often I just want to get started quickly. I do something, and these days, why is it always showing Nico when I'm talking?
I see you. That's fine. Are you saying you don't? You saying you don't want to look at Nico? Is that what you're saying?
No. It's just but he's going to be blamed for stuff I say, though that works for me. What was I saying? I forgot what I was going to say.
I think you would rather just refactor. I would rather.
So refactoring. IDEs are getting really good at refactoring JavaScript these days. So sometimes if it's just for my own code, obviously, if you write libraries, things are utterly different. But for my own code, I'll happily refactor stuff and change it.
Sure. Yeah. For libraries, it's definitely trickier because you can't be breaking the API every 2 days or so. But when it comes to application code, there's definitely a lot of more wiggle room to refactor your code.
It'd be nice if you could deliver refactoring rules with a new version of the library that would refactor the client code so that it uses the new version of the library correctly, but I'm not aware of any solution that exists in that space.
You're talking about having WebStorm or Sublime Text or whatever would have a plugin, and you would pull in the new version of Angular, and they've changed some API signature or something like that, and it would, or just some API name that it would just go through your code and update it for you.
Yeah, you could.
I could see it more as some sort of like a Babel plugin where I introduce breaking changes to my API, but the code still works the same. So when I instruct people to download it, I may even have like a post-install script that, well, not really, but Yeah, something like tell people, okay, for the upgrade path, if you can't bother with it, just install this Babel plugin and it'll change your code so that you don't have to.
I
But
bet that
it's
gets real.
weird because it introduces like maintainability issues when another developer comes in and they're like used to the newer version and they're like, what the hell is this? You know.
I
So
bet that gets
Babel-
real complicated real fast.
Yeah, exactly.
Babel is definitely going to help in that area.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, Babel is great. That is a
I think it's
Babel's
something
a
that we
great
can
piece of
all
software.
agree on.
Yeah. Babel is excellent. Good job, Babel.
Yeah.
But thank you guys for going down that path with me for a little bit. I wasted a large chunk of a vacation I had a while ago trying to decide how I felt about inheritance in JavaScript, and I still don't know. So
Yeah, and another problem you have is the aspect-oriented people call it the tyranny of the dominant decomposition. So whenever you do a hierarchy, there's a single dimension you're attacking. And anything that has to do with categorization is always going to, or usually going to be multidimensional. And that's why class hierarchies usually fail when it comes to properly structuring a problem, and that's why you need some shape or some kind of multiple inheritance like mix-ins.
We've talked about that problem, that giant tree structure that you end up with, is what causes a lot of problems with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So right now, ES6 classes in JavaScript, it is still single inheritance. It's one path down. But there are libraries out there that allow you to do mix-ins with ES6 classes. Correct?
There's a very simple technique that was just recently blocked about, but Angus Kroll actually has, and maybe we can include a link to where he's done that.
Yeah.
He's used that even, let me check, I think a few years ago even. And the idea is that if you have a class and when did he do it? Yeah, so I think quite a while ago. And the idea is if you have a class and the class says extends foo, then you can actually the thing after the extends, that's an expression. So anything that produces a class can be put there. So if you say extends and then the mixin is a function, and then you say extends mixin open parenthesis foo close parenthesis, then you can just implement the mixin as a function that attaches a subclass to a superclass, and you can do that via an arrow function. And that's a very nice technique for actually getting a simple kind of mix-in via plain ES6.
That I actually did not know that specifically. I thought that syntax was very specific to. I thought it had to be a class, but if it is just an expression, then yeah, as long as it, like you said, as long as it returns a class.
Then it can be a function call, and the function you call is the mixin, and the mixin attaches a subclass to the superclass, and it's really a really neat technique.
Yeah, that actually sounds really simple and really awesome. I'm looking at the GitHub now. Yeah, but no, that's very cool. But so there's definitely some work that ES6 classes need to go through. So ES7, ES 2015, 2017, 18, whatever we eventually get to when they implement more stuff. But more reason to have Babel around so we can keep playing with things.
And interestingly, when classes were created, traits were actually one of the main motivations, or one important motivation for having classes. But now the impetus behind traits seems to have somewhat died down, which is a bit of a shame.
Okay, so what time is it? It is. We have a few more minutes left. So one of the last things that I think we should cover is the current state of front-end tooling, libraries, anything like that. Because we've talked about at the very top, we were pretty abstract to just about best practices are, how they come into being. Got a little bit more specific, and now we have talked about how they change. So what is the current state of, just like specifically in the front end? So like front end tooling and libraries, and which can be anything. So this could be about so Babel, anything else. What are those things like now? How have they changed to get to this point, and where do we see them going in the future? I love huge open-ended questions with no clear answers or directions.
Well, we can also ask, what is programming, or
I like it.
what is a model?
Yeah, I like it. But so let's just pick an example. Let's pick something like Babel then.
Yeah.
As an example. So like how and why it started, to what it is now, to where it's going.
I think Babel is kind of born out of a necessity we had, where people kind of wanted to use ES6. It had been spec'd forever and never really finalized until very recently. So this was a need that we had, and it's also, in my opinion, going to become even more ubiquitous in the future, where we will basically, everyone will use it to compile ES6 and eventually ES7. I think it will become this sort of rolling window where we may start transpiling ES7 into ES6 and so on, and never really get rid of the tool, even if Babel becomes too unwieldy and we start using some linear library. I think that position of a transpiler to an older version of the language is something that will keep on using, because it's one way to play around with new features and stay constantly on top of what's coming, and keeping people excited, and testing out the new features in the language and getting feedback to the spec writers and so on. And when it comes to like the state of front-end in general, I think it's we're getting into interesting places, because on the one hand, JavaScript is as mature as it will ever become, and I mean, that came out wrong. JavaScript is like becoming very popular and very mature, and we have all these tools. And it's all great, except that the learning curve is becoming much more steep. So in this year, I think it will be very interesting to watch out for tooling that simplifies a lot of our workflows, because nowadays it can be pretty daunting to tackle a new project and set up React and whatnot. The other day I read Dan Abramov tweet something like it took him a whole afternoon to set up a React for a new project. And this is a guy who's very well versed in what React is and how it works. So it's probably going to take a lot more to a novice developer, and there's when there's that much setup going on, there's also that much potential of doing things the wrong way, or in a way that's not the best that you can possibly do. I think this was well summarized in an article that came out recently that was called something like JavaScript fatigue, where the author basically said that the React ecosystem is great, I guess, but one of the problems that it has is that in encouraging modular APIs, it has laid a lot of the burden of connecting all of these pipes together onto the developer that ends up consuming all these modules. And I think he gave a great example where there was, I don't remember the module, but it had a README that basically said, okay, so this is very simple, this is how you set it up, and then he would require like 10 different modules and compose all of their functions together and be like, okay, yeah, so this works. So yeah, sure, he's adding one single more function to the stack, but it ends up being very complicated for the developer to understand how all that works. So
yeah, the interesting challenge is how to make things simpler without adding even more stuff.
Echo.
So yeah, who's echoing?
Who is it?
Is it gone now? All right. So the problem is that every tool you add to your project is additional mental baggage, and if people have to learn a lot of stuff before they can even use your project, that's going to be a big problem. So as Nico said, in the next year it'll be interesting to see how people actually attack complexity. And the solution cannot be to introduce even more tools or even more layers, but maybe people are going to come up with something, something new, something clever.
Yeah. Well, it's tricky because you can't just say, okay, the way to reduce complexity is you can't do this anymore, right? Like that's not reducing complexity. And actually, Eric gave a talk called, I think he called it like Rehab for Grunters and Gulpers, something. I don't remember exactly what the title was. It was a good title, but talking about, so back, even when I first started, and I'm not gonna pretend I've been doing this forever. It's like, all right, I'm gonna learn how to do this. I'm gonna learn how to do this, and it's like, okay, well, here's your HTML file and here's your JavaScript file. Drop your JavaScript file in the HTML document, and that's it. Then open it in the browser, and you're done, and that is all. And now, if you go through, like you said, taking an entire afternoon to set up a project is maybe unacceptable. Some people maybe don't think so, and a lot of people have written generators. I mean, we even wrote a generator at work to help us with Angular projects. But it's not an easy problem because it's also a mindset, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
So what I think is what I like a lot at the moment, but this is kind of not. This is a tiny bit off topic. It's still about tools, and that is tree shaking. And Rollup has made that popular recently, and basically it says that if you bundle a set of modules, the final bundle only includes exports that are actually used, and that'll hopefully help us to, because right now if you want to minimize the size of a bundle with your library, you'll create common JS modules that are very tiny, and if you look at some of the projects, they have modules that are sometimes only 5 lines long, and then it's more like a scavenger hunt if you want to find out how something works. And with Rollup or a similar technique or a similar tool, you can at least combine stuff that is similar and encapsulate a little with modules again, as opposed to having these micro modules, which sometimes makes sense, but often you also want to encapsulate and group stuff. So that'll be interesting. Yeah. And what I like about Rollup is that the people behind it and other tool people, they're talking to each other. So it's always nice if it's not, if people collaborate, and if it's just not new for newness sake, if it's about a new idea and the people behind a project care about the idea and want that to propagate, and don't care about their tool for the tool's sake.
Yeah, I think we got to, and I'm going back a little bit, to a complicated situation in terms of tooling, because nowadays we have like 4 or 5 different tools that we use that could all be the same. Like they could all go into Babel, like LinkedIn, Browserifying, Uglifying, and whatnot. But then you also have the issue, if you do all that in Babel, that it becomes like too big to fail, right? So you end up like in this banking situation where Babel starts to suck and the front end sucks suddenly. So that's an interesting problem that we'll have to see where it goes. And in terms of micro modules, I think you're right. I think writing very, very small modules isn't really helpful, because sure, you get testing and documentation for every little thing, but David Dalton still did that with Lodash, and they are all very well tested and very well documented, and they're all in a single package that's huge. And with something like Rollup, you could include the whole of Lodash and just forget about it, like people do with jQuery, right, or similar tooling, and then you would just get out of it what you needed. But modules play still an important role when it comes to developing an application that's easy to maintain. Because even if, and I'm not talking about library level here, but application level code, where if you have like 1,000 long lines of code in a file, it's still going to be a mess. So Rollup won't help you at all in there. So it's still an important thing, but I think some people are taking modularity to an extreme when they write modules are like 1 line of code and and 10 different files. You know.
I like Unix, but there's still a lot of room of improvement when it comes to how Unix does its thing. So I'm not always completely happy if someone holds up Unix as kind of the gold standard for designing things.
Well, I mean, it's not like Unix comes just with a naked package installer and has you install Git and, well, yes, Git, but like every single OS tool, it's not coming separately. You still get a pretty functioning operating system that has just enough to get you started.
Sure.
So.
All right, guys.
I think it's a balance.
I actually think that's the best phrase we could probably end this on, is that it's a balance of anything, right? People do take things to extremes, but at a certain point you do have to kind of step back. Sometimes it's just like how it feels. Like some people are very, very strict with how many lines of code can be inside of a function. When it probably should be, it's like, okay, is this function doing too many things? Is it actually too big, or is this some silly standard I've set for myself? Things like that. So, well, first of all, I wanted to thank both of you guys very, very much for coming on and talking to me about a bunch of different stuff, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again, because there's a bunch more stuff that we can get into. So, to close, Axel, starting with you, just go around, reintroduce yourself, tell everybody how they can get in touch with you, if you have any open source projects that you're running that you're looking for help with, anything like that. Feel free to throw it out there now. Plug time.
All right. So so if you want to read some of the stuff that I've written, you can go to duality.com. That's my blog. I blog frequently, and from my blog, there's a series of links at the top, and from that, you find links to my books, and the contents of all of my books are available free to read online. And there's a book on ES5, a book on ES6, and a book on how to configure Babel. So check that out. And the site is duality.com, and that's a 2 and then ality.com. Okay, that's thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so I'm Nicolas Bevacqua, NZGB on Twitter. That's NZGB. And I blog at ponyfood.com. Unlike Axel, you can find most of my writing and open source and conference talks and so on there. I wrote a book called JavaScript Application Design that's not free to read online, but you can still access all of the code samples for free on GitHub. And I'm working on a couple other book projects, but they aren't really mature yet, so I'd rather wait for a little bit longer before I start promoting them.
So stay tuned.
What's that?
I said, so stay tuned.
Yeah.
Twitter is always great. So I'm Rauschmayer on Twitter, and I'm amazed how useful Twitter is in the web development community.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for having me, and it was great talking to you again, Axel.
Yeah,
in a while.
fun.
Nope. Thank you guys very much, and we will talk to you later. This has been episode 75, and we will talk to everybody next week.
Call for proposals is done and registration is open. And O'Reilly Fluent Conf is back in just a few months. Fluent, the web platform conference, will be held in San Francisco, California on March 7th through 10th, 2016. So get practical training in JavaScript, HTML5, CSS, and the latest web development technologies and frameworks. The Web Platform Podcast listeners receive a 20% discount when registering for the conference. So make sure you use the promotional code PCWPP20 to receive your discount. You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at @thewebplatform or on Google Plus and YouTube at +thewebplatform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at @eIsaacson
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.